A millionaire proposed to a maid for a bet, but her heart left him crying for forgiveness. The exclusive club hummed with laughter, the clinking of glasses, and the low murmur of conversation. It was a world of extravagance, where men draped in tailored suits leaned back in leather chairs, indulging in the finest liquor and boasting about their latest conquests. Among them sat Ethan Lancaster, heir to the Lancaster Empire, a man whose name alone carried weight in high society. With his effortless charm and striking features, he never faced rejection. Women fell at his feet, drawn to his confidence, his wealth, and the magnetic pull of his presence. Tonight was no different. He sat at the center of it all, nursing a glass of whiskey, his smirk lazy and arrogant as he listened to the mindless chatter around him. Then, the conversation took an interesting turn. "Admit it," Ethan, one of his friends, Victor, leaned forward, amusement glinting in his eyes. "Women are easy for you because they already want you before you even open your mouth. I bet you couldn't make an ordinary girl, someone beneath all of this, fall for you." Ethan arched an eyebrow, unimpressed. "You underestimate me." Another friend chuckled. "We're not underestimating you, just raising the stakes. No heiresses, no models, no one who already dreams of marrying into money. Let's see you charm a woman who has no reason to want you." A slow smirk stretched across Ethan's lips. He leaned back, considering the challenge. It wasn't about love, it never was. It was about proving a point, about control, the thrill of knowing he could bend someone's emotions to his will. "And what do I get when I succeed?" His voice carried the unwavering confidence of a man who never lost. "If you win, we'll each hand you $10,000. But if you fail," Victor's grin widened, "you admit that your charm isn't as invincible as you think." Ethan scoffed. "Fine, pick my target." The moment the words left his mouth, his friend's gaze swept across the room before landing on a figure near the bar. She wasn't dressed in designer clothing, nor was she draped in jewels like the women in their circle. Instead, she wore a modest uniform, a simple black dress with an apron tied neatly around her waist. A maid. She was busy stacking empty glasses onto a tray, her expression unreadable, her presence barely acknowledged by the people around her. Victor nodded toward the woman. "Isabella Reed. She works here. No money, no power, no interest in men like you. Make her fall for you, Ethan. 2 months." Ethan turned his head, eyes settling on her. He had never noticed her before. Why would he? She was just another worker, blending into the background. But now, as he studied her, something about her intrigued him. There was no desperation in her eyes, no awe when she caught glimpses of the wealth surrounding her. She carried herself with quiet strength, as if the world had thrown its worst at her, and yet she still stood. A smirk curled at the corner of his lips. Consider it done. The game had begun. Isabella moved quickly, balancing a tray as she weaved through the crowd. She had grown used to the world she worked in, elegant, privileged, and indifferent to people like her. She didn't mind it. She had more important things to worry about: her mother's medical bills, making rent, ensuring they had enough to get through another month. She had no time for distractions, especially not the kind that came in the form of rich, arrogant men who only saw people like her as nothing more than background noise. So when she felt a presence beside her as she reached for another empty glass, she barely acknowledged it. "Long night." A deep voice, smooth like silk, cut through the air. She turned slightly, surprised to find Ethan Lancaster standing there, watching her with an easy smile. She had seen him before, of course. Everyone in the club knew who he was. He was one of the elite, the type of man whose world was so far removed from hers that they might as well have lived on different planets. She straightened, her grip firm on the tray. "Just another shift." He tilted his head, studying her. "I don't think we've met properly." "Ethan." "I know." She gave a polite nod, but made no effort to extend the conversation. She had no interest in small talk, especially with a man like him. But Ethan wasn't one to be ignored. "And you are?" "Isabella," she answered, keeping her tone neutral. "Isabella," he repeated, as if testing the way her name felt on his tongue. "Nice to meet you." She merely nodded, waiting for whatever came next. Rich men like him didn't just talk to maids for no reason. You work hard, he observed. I've noticed. Her brows furrowed slightly. I do my job like everyone else. Not everyone does it with the same dedication. She blinked, caught off guard. It was strange, hearing words like that from someone who probably never had to lift a finger in his life. I should get back to work. She adjusted the tray in her hands, signaling the end of the conversation. Ethan watched her for a moment longer before stepping aside, allowing her to pass. But as she walked away, he smirked to himself. This was going to be interesting. Over the next few days, Isabella noticed the strange change in behavior. Ethan, who had never once acknowledged her existence, suddenly seemed to notice her at every turn. He greeted her when he arrived, made casual conversation when she passed by, and offered smiles that seemed just a little too charming to be accidental. At first, she ignored it. Men like him didn't pay attention to women like her unless they wanted something. She had no interest in playing whatever game he was trying to start. But then, there were the moments that chipped away at her walls. A cup of coffee placed beside her station with no explanation. A casual remark about how exhausting late shifts must be, spoken with unexpected sincerity. The way he seemed to linger just a little longer whenever she was near. She told herself she wouldn't fall for it. She knew better. But deep down, a small, quiet voice whispered, what if just this once someone really did see her? Ethan knew how to play this game. It was never about rushing. It was about planting the seed of curiosity, letting it grow until she started thinking about him, even when he wasn't there. He understood the power of small moments, subtle shifts in behavior that made someone second-guess their own feelings. And with Isabella, he was more patient than ever. He had time. He had confidence. And most of all, he had charm that had never failed him before. But Isabella was not like the women he had pursued in the past. She wasn't drawn to luxury or fascinated by status. She wasn't desperate for attention, nor did she blush under the weight of his gaze. If anything, she seemed mildly irritated by his sudden interest in her. And that was what made her all the more intriguing. He started making sure he was in places she didn't expect him to be. When she arrived early to set up before the club opened, she'd find him already there, casually sipping coffee in the lounge. If she worked late, he lingered just long enough to walk past her on his way out. It wasn't a coincidence. It was deliberate. Every encounter carefully orchestrated, designed to make her wonder if he was paying attention to her for a reason. And eventually, she did start wondering. One evening, as she balanced a tray of drinks, she found him sitting at the bar alone. His usual group of friends was nowhere to be seen. That was rare. He was always surrounded by people, always the center of attention. But tonight he was just there, and when she approached to collect empty glasses, he smiled, not with the usual arrogance, but with something softer. You work too much, he said casually, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. She raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. I work as much as I need to. He tilted his head, studying her. And what would you do if you didn't have to? She hesitated. No one had ever asked her that before. Dreams were a luxury she couldn't afford. I don't think about things like that. Why not? Because wishing for things you can't have doesn't change anything. His lips curled slightly. Practical. Realistic. He liked that answer. It meant she wasn't naive. But it also meant she didn't see a way out of the life she had. And that made her the perfect challenge. Over the next few weeks, he chipped away at her walls, little by little. He didn't shower her with grand gestures. She would have seen through that. Instead, he made himself a presence in her life. He learned that she never took breaks unless someone forced her to. So he made sure a fresh cup of tea or a small snack appeared near her station whenever he was around. She didn't know it was from him at first, but when she finally realized, she looked at him differently. Just for a second, he noticed the way her shoulders tensed whenever she checked her phone during her shift, worry flickering across her face before she tucked it away. He saw the exhaustion in her eyes when she thought no one was looking. He wanted to know why, but he didn't push. Not yet. One night, when she stepped outside for a moment of air, she was startled to find him there, leaning against the wall, as if he had been waiting for her. You're always working, he commented. And you're always here, she shot back. He smirked. Maybe I like the company. She crossed her arms, unimpressed. What do you want, Ethan? For the first time, he hesitated. He couldn't tell her the truth, that she was part of a game, a bet made in arrogance. Instead, he said, I think you're interesting. She laughed, shaking her head. You don't even know me. I'd like to. She studied him, searching for insincerity. He had a reputation. Everyone knew it. And yet, there was something in his voice that made her pause. I should go back inside, she murmured, turning away. Wait. His fingers barely brushed against her wrist, a touch so fleeting she could have ignored it. But she didn't. She stopped, her heart unexpectedly unsteady. She didn't know why she lingered for half a second before walking away. But she did. And Ethan knew then he had her attention. It wasn't long before others started to notice. The staff whispered about how the billionaire's son seemed oddly fixated on the quiet, hardworking Maid. Some found it amusing, others thought it was dangerous. Men like Ethan Lancaster didn't chase women like Isabella Reed. And if he was, it wasn't for something real. Even Isabella knew it. She wasn't foolish enough to believe this was anything more than fleeting interest. Maybe he was bored. Maybe he was curious. Maybe she was just a temporary distraction in his otherwise perfect world. But then there were moments that confused her, like the night she had been called into the manager's office, where she was informed that her pay had been increased due to exceptional service. She had never asked for a raise. And when she stepped out of the office, she saw Ethan watching her from across the room, a knowing look in his eyes. She should have been angry. She should have told him that she didn't need his help, that she could take care of herself. But instead, she found herself standing in front of him later that night, arms crossed. Did you have something to do with this? He sipped his drink, feigning innocence. With what? Don't play dumb, Ethan. My salary. He shrugged. Maybe someone finally realized how hard you work. And maybe you had something to do with that. Would that be such a bad thing? She exhaled sharply. I don't need handouts. It wasn't a handout. It was what you deserve. She hated that his words made something stir inside her, because no one had ever said that to her before. Why are you doing this? She asked quietly. He could have given her any answer. A smooth line, a playful joke. But instead, he met her gaze and said, because you matter more than you think you do. She didn't know how to respond to that. And for the first time, Ethan felt something unexpected. This was supposed to be a game, a bet. But standing there, looking at the guarded expression in her eyes, he felt something shift. And that terrified him. The cracks were forming. Isabella was still cautious, still hesitant, but she no longer ignored him. She no longer dismissed every gesture he made. And Ethan, who had thought this would be easy, was realizing that she wasn't the only one being affected. Because the more time he spent with her, the more he wanted to know about her. Not for the bet, not for the game, but because she was unlike anyone he had ever met. And that was dangerous. Because for the first time in his life, Ethan Lancaster didn't just want to win. He wanted her. The transformation was nothing short of breathtaking. Isabella stood before the mirror, barely recognizing the woman reflected back at her. The elegant gown shimmered under the soft lighting, the delicate fabric clinging to her frame in a way that made her feel like an imposter in her own skin. Her usually tied-back hair cascaded in soft waves over her shoulders, and the subtle touch of makeup highlighted the depth of her eyes. Yet, beneath the illusion of grandeur, her heart pounded with uncertainty. Ethan watched her from across the room, an unfamiliar tightness in his chest. He had done this countless times before, dressing up women, presenting them as trophies to the world, proving his dominance over every social setting. Yet, there was something different about this moment. Isabella was not just another conquest. She wasn't a woman who had spent years perfecting the art of high society. She was real, unpolished, and utterly unaware of the power she held over him. As they entered the grand ballroom, the whispers began. Who is she? She's not one of us. A maid? Surely, Ethan has lost his mind. Isabella felt their gazes pierce through her, the weight of judgment pressing down on her shoulders. The elegant men and women around her moved with effortless grace, their conversations laced with superiority. Every step she took felt heavier, as if she were walking through sinking sand. Ethan, sensing her unease, placed a firm hand on the small of her back, his touch both reassuring and possessive. Ignore them, he whispered. They don't matter. But they did matter. Their stares, their whispers, the way they barely concealed their disdain, it all mattered. It reminded Isabella of who she was, of a world she would never belong to. Yet, when she looked up at Ethan, there was something in his gaze that made her hesitate. He wasn't just parading her around like a prize. He was watching, observing, and for the first time, the game felt different. As the evening progressed, Ethan found himself drawn to Isabella in ways he couldn't explain. He watched as she slipped away from the suffocating crowd and knelt beside a struggling waiter who had dropped a tray of champagne flutes. Without hesitation, she began helping him pick up the shards of glass, her concern genuine, her kindness unpracticed. Ethan had been surrounded by wealth his entire life, but never had he seen someone act so selflessly in a room full of people who pretended not to see. It was in that moment he realized that Isabella wasn't just someone he had chosen for a bet. She was someone who was changing him. Later that night, away from prying eyes, they stood on a secluded balcony overlooking the city. The noise of the party was a distant hum, the cold night air wrapping around them. "You don't have to do this," Isabella said softly, her voice carrying an edge of vulnerability Ethan wasn't used to hearing. "Parade me around like I'm something to prove." His jaw tightened. "You think that's what this is?" She turned to face him, searching his face for answers she wasn't sure she wanted. "I don't know what this is." Neither did he. For the first time in his life, Ethan found himself without an easy answer. The lines of the game had blurred, and he wasn't sure if he was still the one in control. He had intended to make her fall for him, but now he was the one standing on unsteady ground. Isabella sighed, her eyes drifting to the horizon. "When I was little, my mother used to tell me that some dreams aren't meant for people like us. That the world doesn't change for us, we change for it." She let out a bitter laugh. I used to hate that she thought so little of hope. But maybe she was right. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. This was not a conversation he had expected. He had prepared for resistance, skepticism, even a little defiance. But he hadn't prepared for this raw honesty, for the ache in her voice that made him want to rewrite every rule he had ever played by. "You don't have to change for anyone," he found himself saying before he could stop himself. "Least of all them." She turned to him then, her gaze steady. "Then why do I feel like I'm just a pawn in whatever game you're playing?" Ethan opened his mouth, but for the first time, he had no words. Because deep down, he knew she wasn't wrong. As the night wore on, Isabella found herself torn between logic and emotion. Ethan's attention, his presence, the way he seemed to understand parts of her she had never shared, it was intoxicating. But the doubts, the fears, the whispers in her head telling her that this was all temporary, they refused to fade. Ethan, too, wrestled with emotions he wasn't ready to face. What had started as a simple wager had become something far more dangerous. He had spent years crafting the perfect persona, playing the game of power and control with effortless ease. But Isabella was unraveling him, piece by piece, and he wasn't sure if he could stop it. And somewhere in the midst of it all, they both realized the same terrifying truth. This wasn't just a game anymore. The music played softly in the background, a melodic hum that wrapped around them as Ethan led Isabella through the crowded ballroom. He had brought many women to events like this before, women who thrived in the world of wealth, who understood the unspoken rules of the elite. But tonight, with Isabella on his arm, everything felt different. The way she clung to his side, her wide eyes betraying a quiet discomfort, made him see the world he had always known through her perspective. The whispered remarks, the judgmental stares, things he had never paid attention to before suddenly felt unbearably loud. She walked with her chin held high, but he could feel the tension in her fingers as they clutched his sleeve. It was a silent plea, not for escape, but for reassurance. And for reasons he didn't quite understand, he found himself wanting to give it to her. He squeezed her hand lightly, murmuring, "Ignore them." Isabella nodded, but her gaze flickered across the room, taking in the way people watched her with thinly veiled disapproval. She was a stranger in their world, a Cinderella forced into glass slippers that had never been meant for her. And yet, She looked breathtaking. The deep blue gown he had chosen for her hugged her figure gracefully, the soft curls in her hair cascading over her shoulders. If the others had any idea where she had come from, they wouldn't have been so quick to dismiss her. But that was the problem, wasn't it? In their eyes, her background defined her worth. The weight of their scrutiny settled deep in her chest, but she reminded herself that this was temporary. This night, this role, none of it was real. She had agreed to this arrangement, knowing she was just another part of Ethan's game. It was a trade, nothing more. So why did it hurt when they whispered about her? Why did she suddenly feel like she wanted to prove she belonged here, even if just for one night? "Ethan, I think I need some air," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the chatter around them. He hesitated, then nodded, leading her toward the balcony. The cool night air brushed against her flushed skin, a stark contrast to the warmth of the ballroom. She inhaled deeply, steadying herself. "You're handling this better than I expected," Ethan remarked, leaning against the railing beside her. His voice held the usual teasing edge, but there was something softer beneath it. She let out a breathy laugh, shaking her head. "Is that supposed to be a compliment?" He smirked. "It means I'm impressed." She turned to look at him, searching his expression for the usual amusement, the telltale sign that he was simply playing his role. But for once, he seemed serious. His blue eyes reflected the city lights, and for the first time, she wondered if there was more to him than just charm and arrogance. Before she could dwell on the thought, a commotion near the entrance of the ballroom caught her attention. A staff member had tripped, spilling a tray of drinks onto a guest. The room buzzed with quiet laughter, unimpressed murmurs passing between the attendees. The woman on the receiving end of the accident looked furious, already berating the server in a sharp, condescending tone. Isabella didn't think. She moved. In an instant, she was at the staff member's side, helping her to her feet. "It's okay," she said gently. "Are you hurt?" The young girl looked at her, wide-eyed, before shaking her head quickly. I'm fine. Her voice wavered as she glanced at the livid guest, still covered in wine. Isabella turned to the woman, offering a polite smile. "It was an accident. I'm sure she didn't mean any harm." The woman's brows furrowed. "And who exactly are you?" Isabella hesitated, unsure how to answer. But before she could find the words, Ethan's voice cut through the tension. "She's with me," he said smoothly, stepping beside her. His tone left no room for argument, and just like that, the woman backed down. Isabella didn't miss the way the crowd's whispers shifted, no longer just about her presence, but about how Ethan Sterling had just defended a nobody. As the moment passed, and the guests turned their attention elsewhere, Ethan turned to her with an unreadable expression. "You didn't have to do that," he said. She met his gaze, unwavering. She didn't deserve to be humiliated over an accident. For the first time in a long time, Ethan didn't have a response. He had spent years in this world, playing by its rules. But Isabella, she refused to. And somehow, that made her stronger than any of them. Something shifted inside him that night, though he wasn't ready to acknowledge what it was. The drive home was quiet. Isabella stared out the window, lost in thought. She still felt the weight of the night's events pressing against her chest. The judgment, the whispered insults, none of it had surprised her. But Ethan's defense of her, that had been unexpected. He had stood by her side, without hesitation. She glanced at him, his profile sharp against the dim glow of the streetlights. "Why did you do that?" she asked finally. He didn't look at her, keeping his eyes on the road. "Do what?" "Stand up for me. I thought this was just a game to you." His grip on the steering wheel tightened slightly. He exhaled, shaking his head. "Maybe I just don't like seeing people treat you like you're less than them." Her heart skipped a beat at the quiet sincerity in his tone. Maybe she was imagining it. Maybe she wanted to believe, just for a second, that there was something real beneath all of this. But she couldn't afford to. This wasn't real. And yet, the walls she had carefully built around her heart were already beginning to crack. Back at Ethan's estate, she stepped out of the car, the night air wrapping around her once more. She had planned to retreat to her room, to put distance between herself and the thoughts threatening to unravel everything. But before she could, Ethan's voice stopped her. "You don't belong in their world, Isabella." His words weren't cruel, but they were certain. She turned to face him, something unreadable flickering in her eyes. I know. She walked away before he could say anything else, but her heart remained restless long into the night. Ethan was right. She didn't belong in his world. But then why did it hurt so much to be reminded of it? And why did it feel like, for just a moment, he had wished she did? The chandeliers cast a golden glow over the extravagant hall, the hum of laughter and conversation blending with the soft melody of the orchestra. Isabella had never seen anything quite like it. The air was thick with luxury, with women in dazzling gowns and men in finely tailored suits clinking glasses, exchanging pleasantries laced with hidden agendas. Yet tonight, for the first time, she didn't feel completely out of place. Ethan had been by her side all evening, his touch warm against her back as he introduced her to people she had only ever seen in magazines. He made it seem effortless, as if she truly belonged here. Maybe, just maybe, she wasn't an outsider anymore. Maybe this wasn't just a fleeting illusion. A gentle squeeze of her hand brought her back to the present. Ethan leaned in, his breath brushing against her ear. "You're doing great," he murmured, his voice laced with amusement. She tilted her head up to meet his gaze, and for a moment, everything else faded away. There was something in his eyes, something softer than she was used to. It made her chest tighten, made her foolish heart whisper that perhaps this was real, that maybe she hadn't been wrong to trust him after all. She excused herself to step away for a moment, needing a breath of fresh air, a moment to collect the swirling emotions inside her. But as she moved through the crowd, a hushed conversation drifted into her ears, stopping her in her tracks. "She actually thinks she belongs here," a voice sneered, laced with laughter. Isabella's blood ran cold. "I still can't believe Ethan actually pulled it off. Did you see the way she looks at him? Like a lovesick fool. She bought it completely. Hook, line, and sinker. He always wins his bets, doesn't he?" Laughter erupted, a cruel, mocking sound that sliced through Isabella like a blade. Her breath hitched as she pressed herself against the wall, hidden just beyond the corridor. Her fingers trembled as she clutched the fabric of her dress, her mind struggling to process the words that had shattered her world in an instant. A bet. Her stomach twisted painfully. The stolen glances, the whispered reassurances, the moments where she had let herself believe he saw her as more than just a nobody. It had all been a lie. Her vision blurred, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear the rest of their words. "Do you think he'll keep her around now that he's won?" "Doubt it. The fun's probably over for him. He'll get bored soon." A wave of nausea washed over her. Every moment she had spent by Ethan's side, every night she had wondered if she was foolish for falling for him. It had all been for nothing. She had been nothing more than entertainment, a joke whispered among his friends. The world around her tilted, but she forced herself to remain standing. She wouldn't crumble, not here, not in front of them. A sudden hush fell over the group, and Isabella instinctively knew why. Ethan had arrived. She could hear his voice, calm and composed. "What's so funny?" A nervous chuckle. "Just talking about your little project." Isabella felt the air shift, the weight of silence pressing down on her. She wanted to run, to disappear before he saw her, but her body refused to move. Then Ethan spoke again, and it was his words that delivered the final blow. "I never lose a bet." A chill ran down her spine. It was true. Everything was true. Something inside her shattered, a quiet, breaking thing that left nothing but an aching void in its place. Before he could notice her, before anyone could see the way her heart was bleeding, she turned and walked away. The world blurred as she moved, her mind screaming at her to stay strong, to not let them see her crumble. She ignored the stairs, the glittering chandeliers, the echoes of laughter that now sounded like mockery. The pain twisted inside her, but she swallowed it down. She didn't need an explanation. She didn't need to hear his excuses. The only thing she needed was to leave. By the time Ethan finally looked around for her, by the time he realized something was wrong, she was already gone. The city streets were colder than Isabella remembered. The night air bit at her skin as she walked, her steps hurried but aimless. She didn't know where she was going. She only knew she had to get away. Away from the glittering lights, away from the people who had laughed at her, away from Ethan. Her heart pounded in her chest, a relentless ache that refused to dull. She replayed the conversation over and over in her mind, each cruel word cutting deeper than the last. She actually thinks she belongs here. Hook, line, and sinker. He always wins his bets, doesn't he? Her stomach twisted, nausea rising. How had she let herself believe in him? How had she been so foolish, so blind? A single tear slipped down her cheek, but she wiped it away angrily. She wouldn't cry. Not for him. Not for the man who had toyed with her heart, as if it were nothing more than a game. She had been nothing more than a bet. The thought made her chest tighten, made the world feel unbearably small. She walked faster, desperate to escape the storm raging inside her. The pain, the humiliation, the unbearable ache of knowing she had let herself love someone who had never truly cared for her. She reached her small apartment building, her hands trembling as she unlocked the door. The moment she stepped inside, she felt her body give in to the exhaustion. The weight of everything she had just discovered crashed over her like a tidal wave. She sank onto the edge of her bed, her vision blurring as she stared at the floor. She had to leave. She couldn't stay in this city, not when every corner held memories of him, of the lies he had fed her, of the way he had made her believe she was special. Her hands clenched into fists. She had been nothing more than a game. With a deep breath, she stood, wiping her face with the back of her hand. She wouldn't let him or anyone else see her fall apart. She had been foolish to believe she could belong in his world. Now, she would do the only thing left, walk away before she lost herself completely. Without a second thought, she began packing. She folded her few belongings with steady hands, shoving them into an old suitcase. There wasn't much to take, just a few clothes, some books, and the framed photograph of her mother that she refused to leave behind. She paused as she held the picture, her fingers brushing over the worn edges. Her mother had always told her to be careful with her heart, to never give it away so easily. She should have listened. A bitter smile tugged at her lips before she placed the frame gently inside her bag. By the time dawn broke, Isabella was gone. Ethan hadn't slept. His mind had been restless ever since the gala, an uneasy feeling settling in his chest that he couldn't shake. Something had felt off the moment he'd returned to the party and realized Isabella was nowhere to be found. At first, he had assumed she had simply needed space. But as the night stretched on, a gnawing sense of dread had crept into his thoughts. Where was she? He had searched the entire venue, asked around, even checked outside in case she had needed air. But there had been no sign of her. The uneasy feeling in his chest turned to full-blown panic when he returned home to find her room empty. His heart pounded as he took in the sight. Her closet half open, the few things she owned gone. No. His hands clenched as he took a step forward, as if moving closer would somehow change the reality in front of him. She had left. The realization struck him like a blow, knocking the air from his lungs. She hadn't even confronted him, hadn't given him the chance to explain. She had just disappeared. A lump formed in his throat as he raked a hand through his hair, his mind racing. Where'd she have gone? Did she have anywhere to go? The thought made his chest tighten painfully. He knew Isabella had no family besides her mother. She had no safety net, no one to catch her when she fell. And he had let her fall. A sharp exhale left his lips as he turned on his heel, already reaching for his phone. He would find her. He had to. Days passed. Ethan had searched everywhere. Her workplace, her usual spots in the city, even the small bookstore she loved, but there had been no trace of her. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. The more time that passed, the more the guilt gnawed at him, relentless and unforgiving. Memories of her haunted him. The way her face lit up when she spoke about her mother. The way she had unknowingly softened the edges of his world. The way she had looked at him, as if he was worth something more than just his money or his reputation. He had ruined everything. He had been so caught up in his own arrogance, so convinced that nothing could touch him, that he hadn't even realized what she had come to mean to him. Now she was gone, and he had no one to blame but himself. He sat in his office, staring at the unopened messages on his phone. His friends had been messaging him all week, but he hadn't replied. He didn't care about their shallow amusements anymore. What had once seemed like a harmless game now felt like the greatest mistake of his life. A mistake he might never be able to fix. But that didn't mean he wouldn't try. With renewed determination, he stood, grabbing his coat. He wasn't giving up. Not until he found her. Not until he made this right. Ethan barely recognized himself anymore. His days blurred into restless searches, his nights into sleepless torment. The city, once his playground, now felt like a cruel maze that swallowed Isabella whole, leaving him stumbling in its emptiness. Each morning, he woke with a renewed sense of urgency, convinced that today would be the day he found her. And each night, he returned to his penthouse, empty-handed, haunted by the weight of her absence. He had never known regret like this. His life had always been one of control, every decision calculated, every risk measured. He was a man who never lost. Until now, his fingers tightened around the steering wheel as he drove through the streets, his eyes scanning every passing figure, every shadowed alley, hoping, desperately, that she would appear. But she never did. His search had taken him to places he had never stepped foot in before. The quiet bakery where she had once mentioned she liked to stop for coffee. The small park where she used to read during her lunch breaks. Even the rundown apartment where her mother had lived before she passed. Every lead, every possibility ended in nothing. It was driving him mad. He had even resorted to hiring private investigators, something he had sworn he wouldn't do. It felt too impersonal, too clinical, just another way to throw money at a problem instead of facing it head-on. But none of it mattered if it brought her back. Days turned to weeks. His world, once filled with effortless charm and meaningless indulgences, was now reduced to one singular purpose: finding Isabella. He barely saw his friends anymore. He ignored their calls, let their messages pile up. They had been a part of the lie that had destroyed her, and he wanted nothing to do with them. His company, his wealth, the life he had built, it all fell hollow without her. The woman he had once seen as nothing more than an amusement, a momentary distraction, had become the only thing that mattered. And he had lost her. It was a cruel irony, realizing the depth of his feelings only after he had driven her away. But he refused to accept that this was the end. He had to find her, because the alternative, the thought of never seeing her again, was unbearable. Isabella pressed her forehead against the cold glass of the bus window, watching the city blur past in streaks of light and shadow. She had made her decision. Leaving hadn't been easy. She had spent days convincing herself that running wasn't weakness, that walking away was the only way to survive. Because staying meant letting the pain consume her. She had given Ethan something she had never given anyone else: her trust, and he had shattered it without a second thought. The memory of that night still clung to her like a ghost, replaying over and over in her mind. The mocking laughter, the casual cruelty, the realization that every moment she had shared with him had been a lie. Her stomach twisted. She had loved him. The truth of it had crept up on her, slow and inevitable. Somewhere along the way, between his teasing smiles and unexpected kindness, she had begun to believe that he might have felt something too. But it had all been a game. She was nothing more than a bet, a joke to be whispered about behind closed doors. She clenched her fists in her lap, willing the ache in her chest to dull. She wouldn't cry. She had cried enough. She had spent too many nights staring at the ceiling, wondering what she had done wrong, what she could have changed. But the truth was simple. She had never belonged in his world, and she never would. The bus slowed, and she pulled her coat tighter around herself, bracing for the winter air as she stepped onto the sidewalk. The small town stretched before her, quiet and unfamiliar, a far cry from the glittering chaos of the city she had left behind. It was exactly what she needed: a fresh start, a place where no one knew her name, where no one would look at her with pity or amusement. She had found a modest job at a small cafe, the kind of place where people lingered over coffee and conversation, where life moved at a slower, gentler pace. It wasn't much, but it was enough. And for now, that was all she could ask for. Ethan was unraveling. Every day, without Isabella, felt like another step toward madness. He had scoured the city, exhausted every resource, chased down every possible lead. Nothing. She had disappeared, slipping through his fingers like sand. And it was his fault. The weight of it pressed down on him, suffocating. He had thought he knew what regret felt like. He had been wrong, because this was agony. He had built his life on power, on control, on winning. But this was a battle he didn't know how to fight. He sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel, staring blankly at the empty street before him. For the first time in his life, he had no plan, no strategy, just a hollow ache where Isabella used to be. His phone buzzed beside him, the screen flashing with an incoming call. He ignored it. It buzzed again. With a frustrated sigh, he grabbed it, barely glancing at the caller ID before answering. What? There was a pause. Then a familiar voice. I found her. Ethan's grip tightened. His pulse pounded. His heart, dead and heavy for weeks, gave a single, desperate beat of hope. Where? A town name. A cafe. A chance. He didn't hesitate. The moment the call ended, he threw the car into gear, tires screeching as he tore down the road. He had lost her once. He wouldn't lose her again. Isabella wiped her hands on her apron, glancing at the clock. Almost closing time. The cafe was quiet now, the last few customers lingering over their drinks. She liked it here. The simplicity, the routine. It wasn't the life she had imagined for herself, but it was safe, predictable, and most importantly, far away from him. The bell above the door chimed, and she turned automatically, ready to offer a polite greeting. The words died in her throat, because standing in the doorway, looking like he had just walked through a storm, was Ethan. Her heart stopped. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then he took a step forward. Her breath hitched. No, he couldn't be here. Not now. Not when she had finally started to put herself back together. But he was. And the look in his eyes, the raw desperation, the unspoken regret, threatened to unravel everything. She gripped the edge of the counter, willing herself to stay calm, to keep the wall she had built firmly in place. He had no right to be here. Not after everything. Not after the way he had broken her. And yet, her heart, traitorous and foolish, still ached at the sight of him. Ethan took another step closer. Then another. His voice, rough and quiet, shattered the silence between them. I finally found you. Ethan sat in the dimly lit corner of his penthouse, staring at the city skyline that once felt like his kingdom. The glittering towers and endless streets used to mean power, control, and success. Now, they were nothing but a hollow reminder of everything he had lost. The life he had built, one of luxury, influence, and careless indulgence, felt empty without her. The expensive suits, the lavish parties, the business deals that once gave him an adrenaline rush, all of it had lost its meaning. None of it mattered when the one person who had ever truly seen him was gone. For weeks, he had searched for her, driven by something deeper than desperation. At first, he had convinced himself that he needed to find her simply because he wasn't used to losing. But as the days turned to weeks, the truth became painfully clear. He wasn't looking for Isabella just to win her back. He was looking for her because without her, he was nothing. Without her, the carefully constructed version of himself he had shown the world was a lie. The realization hit him hard. The man she had walked away from was the man he never wanted to be again. If he had any hope of making things right, he had to start with himself. The first step was cutting away the poison that had surrounded him for so long. He severed ties with so-called friends who had laughed at Isabella behind her back. He distanced himself from the business associates who cared more about status than substance. The lavish penthouse, the sports cars, the endless nights of mindless entertainment. One by one, he got rid of them. They had once defined him, but now they felt suffocating. He needed to strip himself down to what truly mattered. Selling the penthouse had been the hardest, not because of the luxury it represented, but because it was the last place he had seen her. Every room, every piece of furniture held a memory of her presence. The way she used to hum softly while making tea in the kitchen. The way she curled up on the couch, lost in a book, unaware that he was watching her. The way her laughter had once filled the space, making it feel like home. Letting go of the penthouse felt like letting go of the last piece of her he had left. But he did it anyway. He found himself wandering the places that reminded him of her. The small bookstore she used to visit, where she would run her fingers along the spines of novels, lost in thought. The tiny cafe where she had once introduced him to her favorite tea, laughing when he grimaced at the unfamiliar taste. He sat on the park bench where they had once watched the sunset together, his heart aching with the memory of her hand resting so naturally in his. Every place was a ghost town without her, haunted by what could have been. He had never believed in fate, but now it felt like the universe was punishing him for taking her for granted. Time passed, and he realized something he had never considered before. Loving Isabella wasn't just about finding her and convincing her to take him back. It was about becoming someone who deserved her in the first place. He had spent his life chasing power, controlling everything around him, making sure no one could ever hurt him. But love, real love, wasn't about control. It wasn't about winning. It was about being vulnerable, about letting someone in even when it scared him. Isabella had given him that chance once, and he had destroyed it. If he ever got another chance, he wouldn't make the same mistake. But as the days passed without a single clue as to where she had gone, doubt crept in. What if she never wanted to see him again? What if she had moved on? The thought twisted inside him like a knife, but he refused to give up. He had lost everything else. He wouldn't lose hope. Far from a city that still held Ethan's ghost, Isabella was trying to rebuild herself. The quiet town she had chosen wasn't remarkable, but that was exactly why she had picked it. She didn't want reminders of her past. She didn't want to turn a corner and see a place that held memories of him. She just wanted to disappear, to create a life where she wasn't constantly looking over her shoulder, waiting for the past to catch up with her. The cafe she worked at was small and cozy, nothing like the high-end places Ethan had taken her to. But she liked it. She liked the simplicity of it, the routine, the way customers came in with familiar smiles and left with warm drinks in their hands. She had never wanted a grand, extravagant life. She had just wanted something real. Some days, she convinced herself she was happy. Other days, she woke up with a hollow ache in her chest that refused to go away. No matter how much she tried to push him from her mind, Ethan was still there, lingering in the corners of her heart like a wound that refused to heal. She hated that she still thought about him. She hated that a part of her still missed him. But she wouldn't go back. She couldn't. She had learned the hard way that love wasn't enough. No matter how much she had felt for him, it didn't change the way he had humiliated her. It didn't erase the fact that she had been nothing more than a joke to the people in his world. She had spent too long convincing herself that she could belong there, that he could be different. In the end, she had been wrong. So she built walls around her heart, telling herself that she would never let anyone close enough to break her again. She focused on the present, on waking up, going to work, and coming home to the tiny apartment she had rented above the bookstore. It wasn't much, but it was hers. It was a life she had chosen, not one she had been manipulated into. But no matter how many times she told herself she was better off, there were moments, quiet, unexpected moments, when she found herself longing for what she had lost. When she caught sight of a couple laughing over coffee and felt an ache she couldn't explain. When she heard a song on the radio that reminded her of him and had to fight the urge to turn it off. When she lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering if he ever thought about her too. But even if he did, it didn't matter, because she wasn't the same girl who had walked away from him that night, and she wouldn't let herself become her again. Then, one evening, her carefully built world shattered. It was late, and the cafe was nearly empty. She was wiping down the counter, lost in thought, when the bell above the door chimed. Without looking up, she forced a polite smile and said, "We're closing soon." Silence. Something in the stillness made her pause. Slowly, she lifted her gaze. And then, she couldn't breathe. Ethan stood in the doorway. He looked different. There was no expensive suit, no air of effortless confidence. His hair was slightly unkempt, his clothes simple, his face more tired than she had ever seen it. But it wasn't his appearance that stole the air from her lungs. It was his eyes. They were filled with something she had never seen before. Desperation, regret, something that looked a lot like pain. She gripped the counter so hard her knuckles turned white. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. She had escaped. She had left him behind. So why was he standing there, looking at her like she was the only thing in the world that mattered? For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, in a voice so quiet it barely reached her, Ethan said, "I finally found you." Isabella felt the ground beneath her shift, as if the carefully built foundation of her new life had suddenly crumbled. Her grip on the counter tightened as she forced herself to breathe, to steady the storm raging inside her chest. She had spent months convincing herself that Ethan was part of a past she had no intention of revisiting. She had built walls, strong and unbreakable, to protect herself from this exact moment. But now he was standing in front of her, looking like a man who had lost everything. Her heart betrayed her first. It remembered him before her mind could remind her of the pain. It remembered the way he used to hold her, the way he whispered her name in the darkness, the way his gaze once made her feel like she was the only person in the world. But those memories were dangerous. They were poisoned by the truth of who he had been. The man who had broken her, humiliated her, made her feel like she had never truly belonged. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to find her voice. "You shouldn't be here." Ethan flinched at the coldness in her tone, but he didn't move. His jaw tightened, and for a moment, she thought he might argue, that he might slip into the same arrogance he had always worn like armor. But then she saw it, the quiet plea in his expression, the vulnerability that had never been there before. "I know I don't deserve to be here," he admitted. His voice was hoarse, strained, as if the words had been carved from something raw inside him. "But I had to find you." Isabella shook her head, her pulse hammering. "You don't get to do this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't get to show up after everything and act like—" She stopped herself, closing her eyes for a brief second to regain control. "You lost the right to find me, Ethan." He took a step closer, but she immediately straightened, her stance rigid, her eyes warning him not to come any further. He froze, exhaling a shaky breath before running a hand through his unkempt hair. "I know," he murmured. "I know I lost that right, but that doesn't mean I stopped trying." She hated the way her chest ached at his words, hated the flicker of something dangerous in her heart. She had spent months pushing him out of her mind, out of her heart. She wasn't going to let him back in just because he looked broken. Taking a deep breath, she turned away, forcing herself to focus on wiping down the counter again, even though her hands were trembling. "You should go." There was silence, but she could feel him watching her, could feel the weight of everything he wanted to say. But she refused to let herself look at him again. If she did, she wasn't sure she could hold on to the anger that was the only thing keeping her from falling apart. "Please, just let me explain," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She froze. The words were too familiar. She had heard them before, the night he had shattered her world. Back then, she had been too heartbroken to listen. Now, she wasn't sure she wanted to. Ethan must have sensed her hesitation because he continued, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even expect you to believe me. But I need you to know that I'm not the man you walked away from that night." She let out a bitter laugh before she could stop herself, shaking her head. "You think showing up here and saying a few words is enough to convince me you've changed?" She turned to face him, her eyes sharp and filled with disbelief. "That's not how this works, Ethan." He nodded, his expression pained. "I know. That's why I'm not asking you to believe me just because I say it. I came here to show you." Her breath caught, and for the first time, she really looked at him. He wasn't the same man she had left behind. He wasn't wearing the expensive suits that once made him look untouchable. He wasn't carrying himself with the arrogant confidence of a man who thought the world belonged to him. His eyes, once cold, calculating, were now filled with something else entirely. Regret, pain, a desperate kind of hope. "What do you mean, show me?" she asked cautiously, her heart pounding. Ethan hesitated, then slowly reached into his pocket, pulling out a small, folded piece of paper. He placed it on the counter between them, his fingers lingering on the edges before he stepped back, giving her space. Isabella frowned, eyeing the paper warily before picking it up. As she unfolded it, her breath caught in her throat. It was a bill of sale. The penthouse, his cars, his company shares, all gone. Her head snapped up, confusion and disbelief swirling inside her. What is this? The life I had before, Ethan said quietly. The life that destroyed us. I don't have it anymore. She stared at him, trying to make sense of what he was saying. You expect me to believe you gave up everything? I didn't expect anything, he admitted. But I couldn't keep living in a world that made me blind to what truly mattered. I lost you because I was too selfish to see the damage I was causing. So I did what I should have done a long time ago. I walked away from it all. Isabella shook her head, still trying to process what she was hearing. But why? Why would you? Because none of it mattered without you, he interrupted, his voice raw with emotion. Because I finally realized that the money, the power, the reputation, it was all worthless if it cost me the only person who ever made me feel human. She felt the sting of tears in her eyes, but refused to let them fall. She wanted to believe him, wanted to hold on to the hope that maybe, just maybe, he really had changed. But hope was dangerous. It was the very thing that had shattered her before. I don't know what you expect me to say, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Ethan took another step closer, his expression filled with quiet desperation. You don't have to say anything. You don't even have to forgive me. I just needed you to know that I would have given up everything 100 times over if it meant proving to you that I'm not the man I used to be. Her heart clenched painfully, torn between the past that had nearly destroyed her and the man standing in front of her now. She didn't know if she could trust him. She didn't know if she could let herself believe in him again. But as she looked into his eyes, really looked, she saw something she had never seen in them before. Sincerity. And for the first time in months, a door she thought she had locked forever cracked open, just slightly. She wasn't ready to let him in. But for the first time, she wasn't sure she wanted to keep him out, either. Isabella's hands trembled as she folded the paper, her mind struggling to catch up with the whirlwind of emotions surging through her. She set it down on the counter between them, as if the distance would somehow make it easier to process. Ethan had given up everything. The man who once basked in luxury, who lived in a world of privilege and power, had walked away from it all. It didn't make sense. And yet, as she looked at him, she knew it wasn't a lie. Ethan looked like a man who had lost everything, not just the wealth and status, but something far more profound. There was a hollowness in his eyes, a quiet desperation in the way he stood before her, waiting for her reaction. He wasn't demanding anything from her. He wasn't trying to charm his way back into her life. He was just here, exposed, vulnerable. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to speak past the tightness in her throat. Why now, Ethan? Why after all this time? He ran a hand down his face, exhaling a heavy breath. Because it took losing you to realize I never really had anything at all, he admitted. I thought I had everything, money, power, control. But the moment you walked away, I saw my life for what it really was. Empty. Meaningless. I wasn't living. I was just existing. His voice cracked slightly, and he looked away, as if ashamed. So I walked away from it all. The company, the money, the people who only stayed around because of what I could give them. He shook his head. None of it ever made me happy. Not really. A lump formed in Isabella's throat. She wanted to hold on to her anger, to the pain he had caused, to the betrayal that had nearly broken her. But hearing him say those words, watching the way his shoulders sagged with exhaustion and regret, made it so much harder. She looked down at the paper again. And now what? You think that just because you left your old life behind, everything will magically be okay? No, he said immediately. I know I can't undo what I did. I know I hurt you in ways I can never take back. He hesitated before continuing, his voice lower now, almost hesitant. I'm not here to ask you to take me back. I just needed you to know that I see it now. I see what I did to you. I see the man I was, and I hate him. He let out a shaky breath. But I'm trying to be better. Not for you. Not for anyone else. But for myself. Because I can't stand being that man anymore. Isabella's heart clenched painfully. She had spent months imagining this moment, imagining him showing up, begging for her forgiveness, saying all the things she had once longed to hear. But now that it was happening, it didn't feel like she had expected it to. It wasn't satisfying. It wasn't victorious. It just hurt, because she could see the truth in his eyes. And that truth was far more terrifying than any lie he could have told her. Ethan had changed. She could see it in the way he carried himself, in the quiet humility that had replaced his once unshakable arrogance. She could hear it in his voice, the way it wavered with uncertainty, in the way he wasn't trying to convince her of anything, just laying himself bare before her, with nothing left to give except the truth. And for the first time, she felt something she never thought she'd feel again when looking at him. Fear. Not fear of him. Not fear of the past. Fear of what this meant. Because if he had truly changed, then that meant she couldn't just hate him and walk away. It meant she had to face the possibility that the man she had once loved, the man she had thought was lost forever, might still exist. And that thought was far more dangerous than anything else. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay grounded. I don't know what you expect me to do with this, Ethan. He swallowed hard. Nothing. I don't expect anything. He hesitated before adding, but would you let me stay? Just for a while. Just long enough to prove to you that I meant every word. A sharp pang shot through her chest. Let him stay? After everything? The logical part of her screamed at her to say no. To walk away. To protect herself from whatever mess this was about to become. But the part of her that had loved him, the part of her that had never truly stopped, hesitated. Because despite everything, despite the past, despite the pain, she wanted to believe him. And that was the most terrifying thing of all. She clenched her jaw, forcing herself to look at him with as much resolve as she could muster. Ethan, I don't know if I can ever trust you again. His expression didn't change. If anything, he just nodded, as if he had expected that answer. I understand, he said quietly. I wouldn't trust me either. The honesty in his words caught her off guard. For so long, she had been waiting for the moment when she could finally move on, when she could finally say, without hesitation, that she was over him. But standing here, facing him now, she realized that moment might never come. Because Ethan had never truly left her heart. No matter how much she had tried to erase him, a part of her had always been waiting. Waiting for him to come back. Waiting for him to be the man she had always believed he could be. And now he was. She let out a slow, shaky breath. I don't know if I can do this. You don't have to, Ethan said softly. But if there's even the smallest part of you that wants to try, I'll wait. His words settled over her like a quiet storm. Because she knew, deep down, that no matter how much she tried to fight it, she wanted to try. Ethan did not leave town. Despite Isabella's clear rejection, despite the way she avoided him, he stayed. He found a small place to rent near the edge of town. Nothing fancy, just enough to get by. He took up odd jobs, fixing things, running errands, anything that kept him occupied. If this was what it took to prove himself, he would do it 100 times over. At first, Isabella tried to ignore him. She kept to her routine, early morning shifts at the cafe, long walks home, quiet evenings alone. But Ethan's presence was impossible to ignore. He never pushed. He never demanded anything from her. He was simply there. He helped Mrs. Alden fix the fence outside her bookstore, repaired the roof of the cafe after a storm, and even volunteered at the local shelter when they needed extra hands. He became part of the town in a way he never had before. And the worst part? He never once asked her for anything. One evening, Isabella found herself watching him from the cafe window. He was helping Mr. Lawson, the elderly grocer, lift a heavy crate onto the back of a truck. Sweat dripped from his forehead, his once pristine hands now rough and calloused from days of manual labor. This wasn't the Ethan she had known. The man before her was someone different, someone quieter, humbler, someone who didn't expect anything in return. Her walls began to crack just a little. The first real conversation they had since his return happened on a particularly cold evening. She had been struggling to fix the cafe's old coffee machine when Ethan appeared at the doorway. I can help with that, he said, voice careful, as if afraid she would send him away. She hesitated. Then, before she could talk herself out of it, she stepped aside. Fine, but don't break it. A small smile tugged at his lips. I wouldn't dare. As he worked, Isabella found herself studying him. He was different now, not just in words, but in the way he carried himself. Gone was the self-assured arrogance. In its place was patience, sincerity, and something she hadn't seen in a long time, kindness. When the machine hummed back to life, she exhaled. Thank you, she said, the words foreign on her tongue when directed at him. Ethan simply nodded. Anytime. That was how it started. Small moments, quiet acts of devotion. And without realizing it, Isabella found herself softening. Just a little. Then came the moment that shattered the last of her defenses. It was late, the cafe already closed, when she stepped outside to find Ethan sitting on the front steps. He held something in his hands, a small, worn notebook. I found this, he said, offering it to her. It's yours. She hesitated before taking it. Her breath caught when she saw what it was. Her old sketchbook, filled with drawings she had long forgotten. The edges were frayed, the pages smudged with time. I thought I lost this, she whispered, running her fingers over the familiar pages. You left it in my place, Ethan said softly. I've been holding on to it. I used to look at it when I missed you. A lump formed in her throat. For months, she had told herself she didn't miss him, that she had moved on. But looking at him now, she knew she had been lying to herself. The past still lingered, but so did something else, something fragile, something real. That night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her heart warring with itself. Was she willing to risk it again? Was love worth the pain it had once brought her? When the answer came, it scared her more than anything. The next day, she avoided Ethan, needing time to think. She walked aimlessly, letting the cold air clear her thoughts. But no matter how far she went, her mind kept circling back to him. Then she saw it, a reminder of why she had left him in the first place. A sleek black car, parked at the edge of town. A man in a sharp suit talking on the phone, glancing in her direction before turning away. He was from Ethan's old world. A businessman, someone who didn't belong here. And in that moment, fear gripped her heart. Had Ethan truly changed? Or was this just temporary? Would he eventually grow tired of this simple life and return to the world that had once torn them apart? Doubt flooded her, and with it came the wall she had worked so hard to break down. She needed to know, needed to test him one last time. That evening, when Ethan came to the cafe, she met him outside. I can't do this, Ethan, she said, forcing steel into her voice. I can't trust that you won't leave, that you won't go back to the life you had before. He took a step closer, but she held up a hand, stopping him. If you really mean everything you've said, then prove it. Walk away. Show me that this isn't just about winning me back. Pain flickered across his face, but he didn't argue. He simply nodded. If that's what you need, he said quietly, then I'll do it. The next few days passed in a blur. Ethan didn't come to the cafe. He didn't help around town. He was gone. And with each passing day, Isabella felt the weight of her decision pressing down on her. Then, one evening, she heard a knock at her door. When she opened it, Ethan stood there, eyes raw with emotion. I thought about leaving, he admitted, voice shaking. I thought about walking away, just like you asked. But then I realized something. I don't want a life without you. Not because I need redemption. Not because I want to prove something. But because I love you. Her breath hitched. He took a step closer, reaching into his pocket. And then, without fanfare, without grand gestures, he knelt before her. I have nothing to offer you, Isabella, he said. No riches. No promises of a perfect life. Just me. Just love. He held out a simple ring. Nothing extravagant. Nothing flashy. Just a symbol of something real. I won't ask you to forget the past, but I'm asking you to believe in a future. With me. Tears burned in her eyes. She had spent so long running, so long guarding her heart. But love, real love, was always a risk. And for the first time, she was ready to take it. She reached out, fingers trembling, and took his hand. Yes, she whispered. Relief washed over his face. And as he slipped the ring onto her finger, Isabella knew this was their beginning. Not a perfect one, not without scars, but real, and that was enough.